right, now, let's go back to 1637. Or actually, we're moving up to 1639, 1640. The events are start moving fast. Charles, because he isn't getting the tax money, the Parliament now convenes, known as the Rump Parliament, and this Parliament convened for the purpose of opposing the king and his tax. And the king sent his army, or his guard, his palace guard, down to arrest the Parliament. The parliamentarians, knowing of the advance of the guard, ran for it. Now, when the soldiers got to the Parliament building, it was empty. And the king, realizing that things were hot, that they hadn't gotten the leaders of the rebellion, and that the rebellion was now moving into the stage of open military warfare, and that London was the hotbed of revolution, decided to abandon London and to move north where he had more royal lands. So he moved to York and raised his army in York and in Nottinghamshire. Now, by the way, when we think of the king going down there to the Parliament building to raid the place, it is interesting today when Queen Elizabeth goes to the Parliament, what must she do? When the Queen goes to the Parliament today, comes from the time that King Charles sent the army down. She must go to the doors of the Parliament and they bar the doors. Bam! And she knocks without. Who is there? The Queen. They won't open the door to the Queen. Then Elizabeth asked permission to enter. Then they go in and debate it for 20 or 30 minutes whether to let Elizabeth in or not. And they take their jolly old sweet time as they debate pro and con on the matter. Finally, after a while, they always agree to let her in. But before she comes in, she must hand over her mace of authority to the Parliament and come in as a citizen. As a subject. She cannot come in as a monarch. No way can she walk in the House of Commons as a monarch. She walks in as a subject. All right? This was established under Charles sending troops. No troops. Parliament is off grounds to the king, to the monarchy. Because of what happened afterwards. Well, by 1641, things were hot, and the armies were in the field, and the battles were going well for the king, and Rupert, the prince, is sweeping through the south and taking Bristol, and the king was marching down from the north. He swept in and took Wales, and started his march from the west towards London. After battle, the parliamentarians, who were called Roundheads. You know why they're called Roundheads? They cut their hair short because they hated the king's long, effeminate ringlets. Now, while long hairs were called Cavaliers, and the short hairs were called Roundheads or parliamentarians. Anyway, it was the short hairs against the long hairs, and they were fighting it out. And the short hairs were getting the worst of it. The long hairs were winning. And the battle after battle, the short hairs weren't really prepared for this sort of stuff. But finally, at the Battle of Oxford, just outside of London, the parliamentarians were able to at least stand in the field, and the king had to withdraw. This stopped the immediate threat on London, and the revolutionaries got a breather, which they needed. During this time of the breather, the leaders of the revolution, by the way, this is the Great Civil War, not the Civil War of 1860 in this country. The real Civil War was the Civil War in England, 1641 to 1648. This was the Civil War. Our independence was won in 1643, not 83. It wasn't won at Yorktown. It was won at Naseby. But it's interesting that in our history books today, how many of you ever heard of the Battle of Naseby? Isn't it interesting that it has been left out? That the real struggle between the priest kings, between the aristocracy, the elite, and the commoners, the real struggle that settled the question has been removed from our textbooks. Before I get to the Battle of Naseby, let's get to one little point here. I mentioned earlier Charles Finney and his book on Freemasonry. And I mentioned the fact of the courts. Let's take a look at what Charles Finney says in his 1868 text, Freemasonry. He says this: every Mason swears under the most solemn oath that he will come to the aid of his brother when his brother is endangered, whether the brother be right or wrong. Now, let's analyze that oath. This is the oath of all Freemasons. Is that oath moral? At first you might think so. Isn't that nice that you would come to the aid of a brother whether it be right or wrong? It sounds good, doesn't it, until you think about it. If you think about it, you come up with something different. Watch what happens. What if I'm a prosecuting attorney for your city or county or township or state? What am I hired to do? To prosecute to the full extent of the law those who are brought before me to prosecute. I'm to represent the state or the government, aren't I, in prosecuting the criminal to the full extent of the law. Now, I would challenge you to go and find a prosecuting attorney in America who is not a Mason. But let us say one is. Let us say your prosecuting attorney is a Mason, and the man who comes before him is a Mason, a man who has committed a criminal act. Publicly, the prosecuting attorney has made an oath that he will prosecute to the full limit of the law. But privately and secretly, he's made an oath diametrically opposite to his public oath. He has made an oath that he will not but come to the aid of this person, whether he be right or wrong, guilty or not guilty. Now notice what position our prosecuting attorney is in. If he keeps his public oath, he breaks his Masonic oath. If he keeps his Masonic oath, he breaks his public oath. There is no way for him to be an honorable man and keep both oaths. Why? One oath is criminal, the other is moral. What one is moral? Always the public oath. He was hired to prosecute the criminals. His secret oath is always criminal because it is contrary to his public responsibility. Let's go and take the judge. Here is the judge who is publicly hired and sworn into office to be impartial in the cases that are brought before him. Yet in private he has sat and made an oath in which he will be prejudicial to those who are brothers in the order. Now notice something. Does he openly declare to the world that he is prejudicial? Or does he go keep it secret that he is prejudicial? Now notice what this means in law. Here I am, not a Mason, going into a courtroom with a Mason. Am I at a disadvantage when the judge, the prosecuting attorney, and maybe members of the jury are Masons, all sworn to come to his aid? Is there not a conspiracy? Is this made public that this exists? Does the victim in the courtroom know that why he loses? He wonders, why is it that such a decision was rendered? And yet he is fully unaware of the fact that a group of men have combined together for the promotion and benefit of each other in their brotherhood or fraternal lodge, in which is to give advantage in business, or when I go down to get a zoning change, if I have the right handshake, it takes place. If I don't have it, they say, I'm sorry, the law says you can't have it. Does that give an advantage in business to the person who has the right handshake, and the little symbol, and the one behind me, and my high bone, and all that sort of stuff, and the shibboleth? Does it? Why do you think Masons join Masonry? To get an advantage. It helps out in business. It brings trade. Things go smooth down to City Hall. I might get in court someday. After all, you ever known a police chief who wasn't a Mason? You ever saw a sheriff who wasn't a Mason? You ever known a deputy who wasn't a Mason? You ever known a prosecuting attorney who wasn't a Mason? You ever known a judge who wasn't a Mason? Now notice, every Mason, whoever sits down in a jury box, is a liar and a criminal. Because he swears to be impartial when he has already sworn to be partial. How can this Finney say such a man be moral? But more important than this, in all societies in history, there have been two classes of citizens. Those in which are called blue blood, aristocracy, the elite, the insiders, the establishment, or whatever name you want. The inside group. And the outsiders, the commoners, the serfs, the slobs, whatever name you want to put on them. Now, the essential thing for having an aristocracy, a dual society, is this. The aristocracy must control the courts. If the aristocracy control the courts, then it means this. And by the way, this is the same thing as in the Talmud. In the Talmud, the Jewish are to be the aristocracy, the elite chosen people. Therefore, as the chosen people, it is essential that they control the courts. Why? In any elite society, of a dual society, the elite, in controlling the courts, are always instructed by whether it be Masons or the Talmud, or whether we want to look at the Kabbalah, or whether we want to go and take a look at the Knights of Columbus or anything else. By controlling the courts, you are to be fair on all cases brought before you of people who are not in your elite. You're to judge fairly. If they are members, both of them are members of the elite, you're to judge fairly again. But what happens when there is a problem between a member of the elite and a member of non-elite? The elite must always have the advantage. Otherwise, they can't remain elite. It's essential for the aristocracy to have the advantage in the courtroom. This is why you see, for an example, in the feudal system, if one serf would do an injury to another serf, the Lord stood in judgment and judged between the serfs, and he tried to be impartial and fair in his adjudication, right? When there were problems between royalty, one or the other, the royalty class would form together a court and judge the case and administer punishment. But what happened when a member of the inner circle might even kill a serf? Well, that's no crime. Or what would happen if a serf might touch the hem of a royal man's garment? That could be a capital punishment, couldn't it? A capital offense. When you have a dual legal system, liberty is impossible. Let me repeat that. When we have a dual class of citizenry, liberty is impossible. And a dual class of citizenry cannot be maintained unless the elite class control the courts. Next, the elite class generally cannot let the majority of the people know that they are controlling the courts, nor their method of control. And what establishes them? What Finney says in 1668 or 1868 in this country is that unless Freemasonry, which is a conspiracy which controls the court and the government, is overthrown, exposed, and destroyed, that the republic will be destroyed, simply because the law system will be corrupted by the privileged class, and which is slavery and autocracy. Second, he says, unless the church recognizes what the Masonic religion is and expels it from its number, the church will be apostate and be destroyed from within. There is no way for Christians to fellowship or have any hand joining with people who are willing to make secret oaths of such sort. Let's take another oath of Masonry. This oath every Mason must take, and he must swear to under the most dire consequences. And that is that he will keep the secrets of his brother inviolate in his own breast as they are in his, for all crimes that this man might commit, murder and treason excepted. And that left to the discretion of the member. Let's put this down in simple English. It means that if I am a Mason and no another Mason has committed rape, arson, fraud, embezzlement, I must conceal that crime from the public. If he has murdered somebody or committed an act of treason, I can morally still conceal it, but I am allowed to expose it. I'm permitted to expose it without committing a crime against Masonry. Yes?
Up to the seventh degree.
Well, now let's put it this way. In New York and other places, that murder and treason are not accepted at all. And in most places in the Scottish Rite, murder and treason after the 7th degree are not accepted. You must keep all secrets and crimes. But I'm just talking about a Mason, a Master Mason of the 3rd degree. At that point, many of the Masons have not gone to the point of murder and treason accepted, or not accepted. They're still accepted. So I want to give the benefit of the doubt here. On the higher degrees, the murder and treason exception is removed. You must also conceal murder and treason. Now, let's see what the law of the land says. What does the law of our country say if I conceal and know this man has committed murder and I conceal it? I am accessory to the fact. I am co-guilty. I am a criminal. It is not. The concealing of a crime is as much of a crime as the crime itself. What does the Bible hold? The same position, does it not? What does any moral man hold? The same position. What does Masonry hold? The opposite position. Is this a conspiracy? Is it a criminal conspiracy? Oh, yes. The fact is, neither every Mason must swear to lie about all facts of Masonry to any who are not initiated and have not also bound them by similar oaths. He may never tell you the truth about Masonry. He has sworn to lie on all things. For to tell you the truth would be revealing a secret, and to reveal a secret, the punishment is death. All right? If this now is, can the man, a moral man, possibly accept such an oath? Can he bind himself to swear to hide the crimes of all Masons, whatever they happen to be, and to come to their aid no matter what crime they have made, and walk out and call himself a moral man? The mere binding is the evil, not the act itself. It isn't adultery that is evil, it is the lust thereof. It is the very willingness to submit to such oaths that is the evil. What happens, like in America today, where we have over 6 million men who have submitted to such oaths? Do you realize that 1 out of every 6 eligible males in this country have submitted to the oaths? Yes.
It's oaths of Masonry or
Yeah.
all those types.
The oath of Masonry. Now, what I say by eligible, you can't be submit until you're 21. So that leaves out all under 21s. No female can be a Mason. All right? So that leaves out all females. No black can be a Mason. So that leaves out all the blacks. All right? The Catholics can't be a Mason, but we can include them in because of the Knights of Columbus, which are Masons, only they don't know it. Okay? Because there's secrets even within the secrets. See, the Masons are also told when they become a Mason that you're only allowed to know this much at this level. You're not allowed beyond. Can you imagine joining something you can't know all about before you join? In fact, when you join the Masons, you must come in knowing nothing and swear that you will accept all the oaths in the future that you have not even heard or know about. And you must bind yourself to that which you don't even know. And the first thing they say when you come in, and any person should figure this out at the first degree, that you are told as you enter in, blindfolded and hoodwinked, rope around your neck, half undressed, you stand there naked before the men and state, not actually naked at this time, but naked in the fact they've taken everything away from you and half your clothing, that you will not be asked to bind yourself in any oath that is immoral. Now, that's a dead lie, because that's exactly what they're going to have you bind yourself with in 5 minutes. 2, that is contrary to your religious faith. Well, you won't unless you're a Christian. Then it's going to be absolutely contrary. And 3, anything that would interfere with your political beliefs. That's a dead lie, because you must support the Masons in the political endeavors. It is the political conspiracy. You see, Masons support Masons. That's why when you see a candidate, you'll see, if he's known to be a Mason, you won't see this. But if he's an unknown person, you'll see down there someplace, either he'll have on the Masonic pin, like Lester Maddox always wears, or Thurman, or a guy like Wallace, 33rd degree, and etc. You know, or Gerald Ford, 33rd. They'll wear the pin if they aren't, if they're not known. Or there'll be a little Masonic emblem on their advertisement. Or there'll be a statement in there, a member of Lodge 684, Will Son's Lodge 684, or something like that sort. By the way, Hiram Abiff is the widow's son. That is, does not have a father. And it's his name they're raised in the newness of life. Well, anyway. Where were we? Well, we were pumping along there in about 1641. At this time, the leaders of the rebellion decided that they needed to come up with a more effective fighting force. What they had been fighting with is basically mobs of commoners going out in the field and whomping away, and had been getting whomped. They decided they needed to organize this thing into some sort of order. So they set up what was known as the Model Army, withdrawing certain men from the regular army and put them into this elite corps. This corps was designed, most people don't realize today, and warfare during the dark Middle Ages had gotten down to where there were a few knights and the rest of them were just rabble. They were not organized except in a mass around a knight. Well, knighthood by this time had been destroyed. And so when they went to war, you went to war with just a mob, a rabble, and they just went out and it was a good old free-for-all. Well, what the leaders of the rebellion did is decide to set up an army by units, with leaders of units and subunits. And in these units, they would have in the units so much artillery, so many pikemen, so many arrows units, so many swordsmen, and they had something that had not been known for actually almost about 1,000 years, called maneuver. Well, you maneuvered these people into certain positions of advantage, and by orderly attack actually ran a semi-condition of modern warfare. Well, anyway, this model army was established, and the head of the model army was a man named Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was a Puritan of Puritan. He knew no other language and spoke no other language than the King James, the authorized version of the Bible. He was an absolute, unbending, unyielding, pious man. And he only selected for his army men who were also Puritans. He said, you cannot win with bartenders or tapsters. Bartenders don't fight. Common herd, when a thing gets rough, run. But only a Puritan will stand and die because he is not fighting for a tax relief. He is fighting because he is fighting a man who dared declare himself divine. To a Puritan, this was a war against a heretic. This was the destruction of a man who would override the Magna Carta. This was a destruction, a war of a cause for Christ. And these people would not leave the field. So his model army not only was the core force of the rebel army, but Cromwell did something else. The members of his army mounted all the pulpits in England. They did the preaching. They also mounted all the prayer sessions in the regular army. They were the spiritual leaders. They were the missionaries. In the next couple battles, the Ironsides, or the model army, was eminently successful. Finally, at the Battle of Naseby, Cromwell, with just the model army, met the combined forces of the king and Prince Rupert, which were going to finally polish this guy off once and for all. On that morning at Naseby in 1643, the king and Rupert were soundly defeated, and Cromwell stood at the field at nightfall. At this time, King Charles put a name on Cromwell, which has stuck ever since. He called him Ironsides. The man was unmovable. In the next few skirmishes, the king was done in, and they brought the defeated king to London. Now, this was a very unusual thing. Never before in the history of the Western world had a people resisted a king and hauled him a prisoner. A king, a divine man. Oh, not in England. Not to Puritans he wasn't. To everybody else he was. Nobody else would have dared do that. But only in England could it have happened that a king could be brought in chains. He was brought to London, and Cromwell and the leaders of the rebellion pleaded for 90 days with King Charles. The crown is your crown. Pick up that crown and be our king. We will swear our allegiance to you and our obedience. We will pay our taxes. But you must renounce all spiritual authority. Charles would not. A crown without spiritual authority was no crown. It meant he was nothing but a puppet king if he picked up a crown that he could not declare himself divine. How could he stand before the other kings in the King Club of Europe? Here he was, nothing but a man, and they were gods. How could he, when they could say whatever they wanted, the people didn't dare resist, when he had to sit there and think of what the people would think about it before he did it? What kind of king is it that has to consider what the mob thinks? How can you be a king if you aren't God? Charles understood the issue very clear. And so did Cromwell and the rest of the boys. They understood the issue. The issue was the crown but no godship. We got to say something for Charles. He was a strong-willed guy. No way. I'm king. I'm God. The crown and deity. Well, after 90 days of getting nowhere, they took the king's parole. The king's promise that he would not further resist the government, and they released the king, gave him his freedom. The king immediately broke his promise, went out and raised another army, and the Second Civil War started. 2 more years of warfare ensued before the king again was now brought to bay in 1648, and King Charles was brought again a prisoner to London by Oliver Cromwell. At this time, something that had never happened in history before took place. Something today that you and I may not understand how important it was. It was the most cataclysmic event in politics that had taken place since the flood. The people of England put the king on public trial and tried him in court as an ordinary man. He was tried for heresy, for breaching of his parole, for breaking of the Magna Carta, and for creating a rebellion against the government. He was found guilty on all charges in an open trial, given every possibility of defense and counsel. And after he was found guilty, he was sentenced to death by execution of the axe, was taken to public execution, and the king was executed as an ordinary human being. This had never happened before. Can you imagine what that does to the king business if this thing gets out of hand? Can you imagine what this means to the whole world and the order of the structure? After all, in order to have an orderly society, don't we need an elite who plans and organizes and runs? What happens to people wanting to do what they feel and like to do themselves? You're going to have chaos, everybody going every which way. That's what they said when the United States was founded. What are you going to do with this limited government that isn't going to plan and run things? It's chaos. Everybody his own boss, everybody his own king, everybody his own priest. Totally chaos. This is what the Catholics said, and look at the Lutherans. Chaos. What are you going to do? Everybody going to interpret the Bible himself? We got to listen to one interpreter so we all have the same interpretation. What are you going to do? You're going to sit there and have a man read that Bible himself? We might have differences of opinion. Well, I'll tell you, here in this room, there's probably 50 differences of opinion or doctrine right now. Right? But that's not chaos. Not if we have the Holy Spirit. Not if we're Christians. And we have the right Christian love one another for the brethren. There's no problem. There are many issues in which we can debate and discuss. No problem. But this, in the mind of 17th century Europe, was staggering. A king had been killed. What happened? The next issues we see are very interesting. Scotland rebels. Cromwell has to put it down. Ireland rebels. He has to fight Ireland. Spain goes to war against England. He has to and defeats Spain. France, the most powerful and populous nation and wealthy nation in the world, now takes on Cromwell, and Cromwell whomps him. The Germans go to war against him. He whomps the Germans. Holland goes to war. He whomps Holland. He ended up whomping all the kings of Europe with no more than 30,000 men, but every man a Puritan. By 1652, the kings had pulled off. You aren't going to whip this boy. Something else is going with him. The kings had found that here, a little country with no more than 3 million people, a small little nation, France being 10 times her size, and Spain being almost the size of France, combined couldn't whip Cromwell with 30,000 men. Cromwell says you don't fight with bartenders, but you fight with the elite. What are the elite? Christians, Puritans, one who have separated themselves from the world and are willing to die for what they believe. That was his elite corps. Now you can debate the theology of all of this back and forth. I'm just reporting now the history, all right? Anyway, old what they did at this time is decide that they would wait out. Old Oliver couldn't live forever, and when he was gone, they were going to get whoever came up after him. By the way, what did the rabble in the street do after Cromwell, after the king's head rolled? What did the commoner do? What was the common cry in England? Be a king over us, to Oliver Cromwell. They offered him the crown, set up his dynasty, his royal family and his line. Isn't that what the Slavs always do? Now, why did Oliver Cromwell not become king? Well, we could think, and I'd like to think, that Oliver Cromwell was so perfect and so good a man, because I have great respect and admiration for the man, that Oliver Cromwell would not do such a thing. But I know that's not true. Why? Because Oliver Cromwell spent all night with the crown thinking about whether to do it or not. Now, why was he with the crown thinking about it all night if he had already decided not to? He was obviously tempted by that crown. You know, it's quite something to be offered a crown. But in the morning, Cromwell turned it down. Why? Well, that we really never know, but I'll give you my guess. I think there were 30,000 guys who would have done him in, and he knew it. Those boys in the model army weren't in any model army for Oliver Cromwell. And the day he picked up that crown, oh, sure, the Slavs, they would have gone with it. But that model army wasn't going to buy Oliver Cromwell as king. As general, as protector, yes. But when he picked up that crown, he was no better than the last one. And he shoved it aside. In 1658, Oliver Cromwell died. Upon his death, the threats were levied against his son Richard, and Richard resigned in 90 days as protector of England, and the monarchy was restored. When the monarchists returned to England and seized the throne, they went down to Westminster Abbey and dug up old Oliver's mother, who was buried in Westminster Abbey, and tossed her out. Then they dug up Oliver, and they took Oliver's body and hung it in a public hanging in Tinsdale Square. And after they had finished hanging Oliver Cromwell, you know, these fellows have to do this. How many times were people died in the dungeons in the Inquisition and hauled out and burned at the stake afterward? They got to get the whole show in, regardless of whether the guy has died or not. I mean, when they're going to take out their vengeance and wrath, they'll do it against the corpse if necessary, but they've got to have their vengeance, don't they? When they got done hanging Oliver, they cut his head off. And they put his head on a pike over Westminster Abbey in the House of Commons, where it hung for 100 years. Sweet boys, huh? But you know, I keep thinking of old Oliver Cromwell up there at that pike. And the king was saying to the members of Parliament, see what happens to one of the boys that get out of line. But old Oliver was smiling down from that pike and says, yes, O king, and remember what happens to a king who calls himself God. You see, after Oliver Cromwell, no monarch in England ever dared declare themselves a spiritual ruler. That was settled at the field of Naseby. At the field of Naseby was settled the right of a people to resist a ruler who broke the law of the land, because that ruler was a criminal like any other. And that settled as far as the English mind was concerned, the right of an Englishman to resist the crown when the crown broke the law of the land. And therefore, when the Stamp Acts and the Tea Tax were passed, to an English mind in the colonies, the right of rebellion was now established. The right of resistance to the crown. For the crown had usurped its authority and stepped beyond its limits, authorized by the infallible, unchangeable traditional Constitution of Great Britain, which is inviolate in the hearts of every Englishman. Supposedly, they tell you that anyway. They believe it. And therefore, the American Revolution was already established, and its outcome could be easily predicted. In fact, to show you that that is the case, in 1766, a man named Remember the British Parliament? It was the plea to the colonies, the plea for the colonies by Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke, the great parliamentarian. This happened to be, by the way, 2 weeks after the war had already broken out. Though he didn't know it yet. When he made a plea for called the Reconciliation of the Colonies, was the name of his speech before the Parliament, stating that the Parliament must press upon the King to withdraw immediately of the positions he was holding towards the colonies. For the colony's strength and growth were such that it could not be forced or coerced. And the law cannot be violated in the colonies, for it was growing at such a rate that liberty, its political liberty and separation, was already established and inevitable. But for England's sake, they must deal with the colonies as equals in order to preserve for England in the future a friend and an ally when that time came for separation. And he cited the facts and the details and his predictions of history before the Parliament. Very interesting speech to read, by the way, The Conciliation of the Colonies by Edmund Burke. A very moving speech. Only by the time he had made it, the die was already cast. Bunker Hill had already been. It was in the history books, and the armies were in the field. So it was a little late. But it shows the fact that the Englishmen understood, and English sympathy, by the way, was strongly for the colonies. Because the issues that the colonialists were fighting for were the same issues that their fathers had fought for back at Naseby. Now, the Cavaliers at that time, one of the families of the Cavaliers at the time of Cromwell was the Washingtons. The Cavaliers, as the King's forces lost, started abandoning England, many of them going to Northern Ireland, in which we find the setting up of the Protestant Free State in Northern Ireland, which is what we see today. All right, Ulster, or the northern 6 counties of Ireland. And many of the Cavaliers came to America, Washington's family being one of them. That's how Washington came to here. They were of the royalist group of the Cavaliers. After the fall of Cromwell, or death of Cromwell, and the reestablishment of the monarchy in 1662, the king issued a new decree. That is, those who were rebels against the crown, this is now 10, 15 years before, and dissenters against the church, had lost their right of citizenship, and that they could not preach in public service. Now, this Dissension Act, or the Expulsion Act as it was known, set off a complete revolution in England. Why? All of the dissenters, or called Covenanters, those who had covenanted against the king and covenanted for a Christian rule in England with Oliver Cromwell, became public criminals and were now hunted down as common animals all across England. The British Army now and police swept across Wales, southern England, Scotland, finding all who had sided with Cromwell, and a systematic extermination. Many of these people, however, fled and went to the colonies. So we now had, 10 years before, a wave of Cavaliers. Now we got a wave of Puritans coming to the colonies in the 1660s and the 1670s. But there was a tremendous result of this. The result of the Christians, the Puritans, leaving England or being exterminated in England soon resulted in a complete religious breakdown in England. The religious breakdown got so bad that the official religion of the Anglican Church was straight deism. That is, God is not known or unknown. The Bible is nothing but an ancient book of myths in which cannot be depended upon. We know that there is a prime force, a original force, which we call God, which we cannot know anything about and does not direct the affairs today in this world. This God started the world going, created the world, and now is sitting passively by while the world's events are taking place, are accidental, and he has no hand or part in it. This is known as deism, and deism became the religion of England. It is interesting, in a matter of 15 years, the transition from the absolute sovereign and a personal God who directly controlled the events in the life and times of the people, switched to a religion of an unknown God, a prime force who had no control or direction at all in the events that were taking place. It was the transition from the one religion to the other that led England into the greatest moral decay, in which we get the movies like Tom Jones and these other things. England became the ribald country of open sex promiscuity, and in a few years entered into a new age which was known as the gin craze. Now the gin craze, England, the nation as a whole, went on the greatest massive drunk the world has ever known. In fact, at the height of the gin craze, 1 out of every 6 buildings in England were selling alcoholic beverages. The nation was bombed out, and the economy collapsed. The morals degenerated to such a level that the Church of England, by 1730, had now stated that adultery was not a sin, concubinage was not a sin, and what was another? Homosexuality was not a sin. Sounds kind of like 1974 at the Methodist Convention, doesn't it? Now, I want to tell you, things are not different. The common preaching of the clergy of 1730 in England was this: that revival in England was impossible, the time was past, the end was here, the rapture had to come. For there had never been such a time of debauchery and moral decay as there was in England in the first part of the 18th century. At this time, in 1730, a young man, 21 years old, went out to preach. He started preaching in a couple churches around London, and started drawing some pretty good crowds. But he was preaching against the practices of the clergy, the immorality, the wealth, and the pomp in which they were living in, and the hypocrisy of this clergy of the church in which he was in. He also was preaching against the doctrine in which they were giving, a doctrine that the clergy did not like. But he drew great crowds, 2,000 and 3,000 and 5,000 in only 2 or 3 months of his ministry. And then he left for America as a missionary, came to Georgia, Savannah, Georgia, with only 500 people in that whole place. And down in Savannah, Georgia, and the way over, he had a magnificent ministry, returning a year later. And then in 1737, this man did something that had never been done before. He went out at the coal mines and in Kingston and stood in an open field, something which an ordained preacher could not do. But there was no church there for these coal miners who lived as animals in the hole, totally black, never washing, coming out of their little shacks and going down into the mines just like roaches that nobody even had any communication with. They were almost an isolated community that nobody even knew existed. He went out on that hillside, and he said the first time he ever knew that any of them were even white as the tears streamed down their blackened faces and the white streaks started appearing in the audience. The second time he preached, he had 200 the first time, the second time 5,000, the third time 20,000. At the end of a week, he was drawing 40,000 per service. He started in Bristol, and he was preaching Bristol and Newcastle twice a day at each place, from 20 to 40,000 per sermon, and teaching 3 times at night every night before the societies. Soon after 8 or 6 weeks at Newcastle, he brought down a man who said he was of the same doctrine, named John Wesley, to take over his work. But John Wesley switched the doctrine and started building a church and a denomination, as this man went up to London and started his ministry in London. He preached only 8 weeks in London. He was drawing 80,000 per service. 80,000 people. A little frail man with just his voice. As Benjamin Franklin said about this greatest preacher of all times, he spoke to more men than ever known any person ever to do. His voice was so perfect. His diction so absolutely perfection. His carrying capacity unbelievable. His delivery so unpresumptuous and sincere that he was able to move the most hostile audiences in the matter of minutes. He was the greatest evangelist the world had ever known. His name, George Whitefield. Most of you haven't even heard of him, have you? No, you hear of John Wesley, the man who came along, switched the doctrine, took his converts, and built a machine to support John Wesley and build a church which had a complete opposite doctrine of the man who built it, George Whitefield.